Life in the Viking Age was as deadly as any battlefield. Beyond swords and axes, an unseen enemy stalked every hall diseases that rotted flesh, drained strength, and left warriors broken long before their time. Some tried herbs, charms, or the wisdom of the gods. Others simply suffered, waiting for death to come. From fevers that swept through villages to wounds that turned black with infection, these were the gruesome Viking diseases and the desperate cures, or lack of them, that shaped their world. Let's uncover the hidden horrors of Viking health. In the sagas of the North, where firelight flickered on rough-hewn beams and the sea winds carried whispers of doom, life was always lived on the edge of a blade. The title, 7 Most Horrific Viking Diseases and Their Cures, or lack of, is no tale of fancy. It was the very shadow beneath which every Viking man, woman, and child walked. Long before the learned hands of healers knew the cause of illness, the people of Scandinavia understood one truth well. Life was brief, death was near, and disease was a foe as fierce as any sword-wielding enemy on the battlefield. A Viking child might wake one day with strength in his arms, racing along the fjord's edge, only to be struck low the next by a cough that brought blood to his lips. A Viking woman, hardened by winters and childbearing, might endure raids, hunger, and storm at sea, but be undone by a fever that burned the flesh and left her breathless in the night. To live in that age was to live with constant fear of what could not be seen, the unseen hand of sickness that stole away kings and thralls alike, without warning, without mercy. Death was not rare, it was expected. The longhouses, warm with smoke and Viking food simmering in cauldrons, were also breeding grounds for infection. Smoke clung to rafters, choking lungs and leaving men open to slow, wasting illnesses. Floors of rushes concealed rot and filth, where vermin scurried, carrying plagues upon their backs. Water drawn from streams might be clouded with the refuse of animals, yet it was drunk without hesitation. A single cut from an axe or blade, so common in the daily labour of a Viking farmer, could fester into a death sentence. And, with each death, another tale was carved into memory, another ghost added to the shadows of the hall. The Viking way of life, fierce and adventurous, brought them to the far reaches of the world, from the icy shores of Greenland to the shining gates of Constantinople. But with travel came pestilence. Diseases crossed oceans as swiftly as dragon-prowed ships, riding unseen on rats, grain, and human breath. A Viking raider might return victorious with silver, slaves, and spices, yet bring home to his kin an enemy more terrible than any Frankish knight, a disease that would spread from hearth to hearth, leaving desolation in its wake. The people explained it as a curse, a punishment from the gods, or the touch of malevolent spirits. If Thor's hammer could protect them in battle, perhaps charms, runes, or blood sacrifices could protect them from the rot of the body. Yet often, the gods remained silent. The seer might chant, the healer might grind herbs into salves, and still the Viking man wasted away. Their faith, however, was unbroken. To die of sickness was not shame, though warriors feared that such a death robbed them of the chance to fall with sword in hand and feast in Valhalla. Still, it was the lot of many. Disease, then, was not simply an affliction of the body, it was a test of the soul. It reminded every Viking child that strength was fleeting. It reminded every Viking farmer, while sowing fields or tending cattle, that no harvest could shield him from unseen decay. It reminded every Viking woman who endured childbirth that her bravery might still be rewarded with a fever that would carry her away before the babe was weaned. This was a world without mercy, a place where courage was measured not only in the clash of steel, but in enduring the silent assault of disease. And as the sagas tell us, these 7 most gruesome Viking diseases, and the desperate cures, or lack of them, that followed, would shape not just the fate of individuals, but the destiny of an entire people. When a Viking man felt the heat of fever burning through his veins, or when a Viking child's skin broke into a rash that no herb could soothe, the cause was not sought in the hidden world of blood and bone, but in the realm of gods and spirits. To the Norse mind, sickness was never without meaning. It was a blow struck from unseen hands, a message from the gods, or the touch of wandering spirits who moved in the dark places between Midgard and the other worlds. In the Longhouse, when coughs echoed through the smoky air, or when the cries of the sick disturbed the night, all knew that such affliction was not chance, it was fate. The sagas whisper of Odin, who gave up an eye for wisdom and hung 9 nights upon Yggdrasil for knowledge of the runes. To such a god, men prayed for healing charms, believing that words carved into bone or stone could drive illness from the body. A healer might inscribe runes of protection on a piece of driftwood, dip it in water, and give it to the sick to drink. If the gods favoured the sufferer, the fever might break. If not, it was clear that death had been written already into the thread of fate spun by the Norns. Illness was also seen as the work of malicious spirits, wandering Draugr, or the wrath of a dead man wronged. A Viking family might speak of a ghost who returned not only to haunt the living, but to weaken their flesh, striking them with wasting sickness until an offering was made, or the corpse properly buried. Sometimes, when disease spread swiftly through a hall, suspicion fell upon sorcery. Women skilled in Seither, the old magic, could heal with chants and herbs, or curse with whispers that brought rot to skin and madness to the mind. The line between healer and witch was as thin as smoke, and many a Viking feared both. The gods themselves were thought to hold power over the flesh of men. Thor's hammer might be invoked to ward off plague, for just as he slew giants, so could he crush the unseen demons of disease. Freya, goddess of fertility, was called upon when childbirth brought fever and blood, her name spoken in desperation over the bed of a woman slipping into the shadows. Even Loki, the trickster, was blamed when convulsions or madness seized a body, his mischief twisting the bones and setting fire to the mind. The cures reflected this belief. A sick man might be given herbs steeped in ale, while charms were sung to call upon divine favour. A Viking woman suffering from wasting illness might wear amulets of bone or iron, thought to shield her from spirits that lingered near. Ailing children might be passed through the smoke of a sacred fire, the ashes scattered to carry away the sickness. If these failed, sacrifice was the final plea. A goat, an ox, even in dark times a thrall, might be offered at a sacred grove to win the mercy of the gods. Yet, despite the prayers and offerings, many still died. To the Viking mind, this was no cruel accident, but the will of fate. Disease was another battlefield, unseen, yet as real as steel and shield. And though it robbed them of strength, it did not strip them of meaning. To suffer was to be tested, to endure was to honour the gods, and to die was to take the road that the Norns had woven from the first breath. Thus the Vikings lived between gods, spirits, and sickness, never seeing disease as mere misfortune, but as part of the endless struggle that bound them to their world and to the will of powers greater than themselves. The Viking world was a place of raw endurance, where storms lashed the seas and winters gnawed at bone. Against such might, a Viking man could lift his shield or draw his sword. But when fever came, when the flesh split into sores, or when a Viking child wasted away with sunken eyes, no blade could help. In those moments, hope was sought not in steel but in healers, herbs, and rituals passed down through memory and song. These were the tools of survival when sickness struck, fragile weapons in a war against unseen enemies. Every village had its folk healers, men and women known for their knowledge of roots, leaves, and charms. They were not physicians in the sense of learned scribes from distant lands, but practical keepers of wisdom gathered over generations. A Viking woman might rise before dawn to cut angelica from the meadow, its root prized for clearing the lungs of phlegm. Yarrow was crushed to stanch bleeding wounds, while garlic was chewed or steeped in broth to drive poison from the body. These herbs were gathered at precise moments, for timing was thought to grant them strength. A root pulled at midnight or a leaf plucked under the full moon might hold greater power than any other. But the healer's work did not end with plants. Rituals wove through every cure. A Viking man suffering from fever might be bathed in water infused with herbs, while runes of healing were carved into wood and placed by his bed. Charms were whispered in low voices, for words were thought to bind or banish spirits. Smoke was a common ally. Herbs were burned so that the sick could breathe in their power, while the fire's cleansing flame was believed to drive away ill luck and lurking demons of disease. There was also the use of animal parts, for beasts too were thought to carry strength within them. The fat of a bear might be rubbed into wounds to grant the animal's endurance, or the marrow of a stag boiled into a broth to restore vigour to the weak. Viking food itself often became medicine. Ale mixed with bitter herbs, honey boiled with bark, or fish oil poured over the tongue to ward off decay. Such cures were harsh, but so too was the world that demanded them. Not all remedies came from plants and beasts. The healer might also turn to seether, the old magic. Songs, chants, and the weaving of runes were thought to bend fate itself. A Viking child who could not sleep from sickness might be passed through the smoke of 9 herbs, each representing protection, while incantations called upon Odin or Freya for mercy. Sacrifice, too, played its part. A goat, its blood spilled into the earth, might be offered to ask the gods to lift the hand of disease from a hall. Yet, for all these efforts, death often won. Still, the rituals were not without meaning. They gave courage to the sick, hope to the families, and dignity to the dying. In the dim light of the longhouse, where fire crackled and herbs hung drying from rafters, there was a sense that even against the most merciless foe, the Vikings did not stand helpless. They stood armed with what knowledge and faith they could muster, turning leaves, chants, and sacrifice into shields against the darkness. Thus, healers, herbs, and hope formed the quiet battlefront of the Viking Age, where survival was not only fought with axe and sword, but in the hushed prayers, bitter brews, and whispered charms that sought to keep sickness at bay. Blood spilled often in the Viking world. Whether from the swing of an enemy's sword, the slip of an axe while splitting firewood, or the tearing of flesh during a hunt, wounds were as common as the salt spray upon the prow of a longship. Yet in that age, the true terror was not the cut itself, but what followed. The curse of blood and bone was a slow enemy, creeping unseen into flesh and marrow, turning victories into funerals and everyday toil into a death sentence. A Viking man might stagger home from battle with little more than a gash across the arm, proud that he had stood firm against his foes. But within days, the wound could swell, redden, and throb with agony. Heat would spread through his body, his breath quicken, his strength falter. His kin would see the veins darken, like lines of blackened rope crawling from the wound, and they would know that something more sinister than the enemy's blade now stalked him. No sword could cut down this foe, for it was hidden within his own blood. For the Viking child, even a simple scrape from playing in the dirt of the farmstead could prove fatal. Infection set in quickly when wounds were left open to the filth of earth, the droppings of animals, and the grime that clung to every surface of the longhouse. The rushes underfoot hid decay, while rats and insects spread corruption unseen. What began as a scratch could soon fester, oozing pus, the body weakening, as if the Norns had woven death into the child's thread before it had barely begun. Healers did what they could. Wounds were washed with ale or salt water, the sting endured in silence by the Viking man who refused to cry out. Poultices of herbs, yarrow, garlic, honey, were pressed against the flesh in hopes of drawing out the poison. Hot iron might be applied to sear the wound shut, the stench of burning flesh filling the hall as the injured bit down on leather to endure the pain. Sometimes the bleeding was stanched, the wound closed, and the sufferer lived, but more often the fever returned. blood turned foul, the mind grew delirious, and the body wasted into shadows. Broken bones were no less feared. A leg shattered in battle or by the fall of a tree often doomed the Viking farmer. Without knowledge of setting bones cleanly, many healed crookedly or not at all. Infection lurked in the marrow, swelling the limb, spreading through the body, until even the strongest warrior was reduced to trembling weakness. In such moments, death was a release, though bitter to those who longed for a warrior's end beneath the open sky of battle. The curse of blood and bone was cruel because it struck where men thought themselves safe. A wound survived on the battlefield could later betray them at home. A Viking woman who endured the agony of childbirth might perish days later from the fever of infection, her strength stolen not by the act itself, but by what lingered unseen. Such deaths seemed unjust, yet to the people of the North they were part of the fate woven by higher powers. For the Vikings, wounds were more than torn flesh. They were openings through which death crept silently, robbing the hall of fathers, mothers, and children alike. Against such a foe, their bravery was tested not only in the clash of arms, but in the silent endurance of fever, the whispered prayers, and the desperate faith that herbs and sacrifice might hold back the darkness. Yet more often than not, the curse claimed its due, leaving only sorrow and the tale of one more life taken by blood and bone. They called it the living death. In the Viking world, where courage was measured by axe and oar, no man feared an enemy he could see. But leprosy was a foe that crept silently, disfiguring, weakening, and haunting without the clang of steel. For a Viking man who prided himself on strength, or a Viking woman who toiled through childbirth and winter hunger, there was no fate more feared than to wither while still breathing. It was not sudden, like the strike of a sword. It was a long exile from the warmth of the hearth, a slow stripping of flesh, dignity, and kinship. Leprosy first showed itself with small changes, so subtle that many turned away in denial. A numbness in the fingers, a patch of skin gone pale, a tingling that never ceased. A Viking child might complain that he could no longer feel the sting of frost on his toes, and his mother's heart would sink with dread. As days passed, the signs grew harsher, skin thickened and cracked, eyes inflamed, flesh ulcerated, faces changed, noses collapsed, hands twisted like gnarled roots. It was as though a man's body betrayed him piece by piece, marking him as cursed. In villages, the presence of a leper was met with unease. Some whispered it was the judgment of the gods, a punishment for hidden sins. Others thought Draugr, the restless dead, had touched the sufferer with decay. A Viking family struck by the disease bore the weight of shame and fear, for many believed that even sharing food or breathing the same smoky air of the longhouse could call the living death upon them too. The afflicted were often cast out to the edges of settlements, forced to live apart, their voices carried only in the sigh of the wind through the trees. Yet the afflicted were not wholly abandoned. Across the north, shelters rose small halls where lepers could gather together, tended sometimes by those too old to fear death, or by women who believed service would bring them closer to the gods. Here, the sick shared Viking food offered by kin or strangers, and chaplains or healers whispered prayers over their broken bodies. Some lepers themselves found strange strength, believing their torment reflected the suffering of Christ, and thus they would be welcomed into the afterlife with honour. In this, even despair was given meaning. Cures were few, and most were desperate acts of hope. Salves of honey and garlic were rubbed into wounds, herbs boiled into bitter draughts, and charms were carved into wood and bone. Some believed immersion in cold water could cleanse the sickness, while others turned to smoke, waving burning herbs over sores in hopes the spirits of disease would be driven out. But no matter the remedy, the disease endured, slow and relentless. The tragedy of leprosy lay not only in the body's ruin, but in the spirit's exile. To be a Viking man struck down in battle was an end sung of in sagas, but to be a leper was to be silenced, hidden away, remembered only in whispers. It was a death that stretched across years, an unending twilight between life and the grave. And still, in the quiet halls of the sick, one truth echoed. Though flesh may fail, and kin may turn away, fate was inescapable, and even the living death was only another path woven by the Norns. The leper was seen as a man marked by the gods, set apart from his kin as though branded by a curse. In a world where strength, health, and honour bound Viking life together, leprosy tore those bonds apart. The disease was slow, cruel, and relentless, eating not only the flesh but the very place a person held within their village. A Viking man, who once stood proudly at the prow of a ship, or laboured in the fields with calloused hands, could become unrecognisable. His face twisted by lesions, his limbs weakened until he could not even hold a cup. To those who saw him, it was as if the gods themselves had declared his life unclean. The fear of leprosy ran deeper than the wounds it carved into the body. It was not simply sickness, it was shame. To bear the scars of the living death was to carry the weight of sin in the eyes of many. A Viking child, innocent yet afflicted, might be pitied, but whispers would still rise that the family had offended some spirit, that dark deeds had brought divine punishment upon their household. In this way, leprosy spread not only in the flesh, but through fear, tainting the name of an entire kin group. Exile was often the only path. Those touched by the disease were driven to the edges of the settlement, cast beyond the warmth of the fire and the closeness of kin. A Viking woman, once surrounded by the chatter of family and the smell of Viking food cooking on the hearth, might find herself alone in a hut of rough timber, left with silence and the ache of her sores. Bells or clappers were sometimes given to lepers, forcing them to announce their approach, so that others might step aside, as if death itself walked the road. And yet, not all was cruelty. There were places, leprosaria built near churches or crossroads, where the afflicted could live together. Here, the stigma was softened, for they were among their own, sharing their meagre food and prayers, clinging to what dignity they could salvage. A healer or priest might visit, offering salves of herbs, whispered charms, or words of scripture. To endure suffering was sometimes seen as a holy act, a trial that brought a leper closer to the divine. In this belief, pain became penance, and exile a kind of sacred passage. Still, the loneliness of the leper was unbearable. To be cut off from the laughter of the hall, from the bond of work and feast, was to die before death. Their presence was thought dangerous, not because of what was truly known of the disease, but because their twisted faces and withered hands stirred dread in the hearts of others. The leper was a reminder that even the strongest Viking man or the proudest Viking woman could be undone, not by steel or storm, but by the slow hand of fate. Thus they lived, marked by the gods, wandering on the edge of life and death. Neither fully among the living, nor embraced by the grave, they bore their exile with the heavy silence of those who knew their fate could not be unbound. And in their suffering, the villagers saw not only the cruelty of sickness, but the fragile line that tethered every Viking soul to the mercy of unseen powers. Far from the warmth of the hearth and the laughter of the longhouse, the leper lived out his days in isolation. Once he had shared in the work of the fields, or stood side by side with other Viking men at the oars. But leprosy made him an outcast, cut away from kin and kinship. The disease stripped not only his flesh, but his place among his people, leaving him with silence, shame, and the faint hope that someone, somewhere, might still show him mercy. Healing in isolation was never the cure it promised. It was survival on the edge, where primitive care mingled with faint sparks of Christian compassion. In the northern lands, those touched by the living death were often sent to dwell on the margins of villages, in huts of rough stone or timber where the wind crept through every crack. A Viking woman with the disease might tend her sores alone, using what herbs she knew: garlic to rub upon wounds, honey to keep rot at bay, or bitter teas of yarrow and juniper. Such remedies eased pain but did not banish the disease. A Viking child who had once run free in the meadows might be kept in seclusion, watched over by family from a distance, his toys of carved bone abandoned as his body weakened. The herbs, the chants, the smoke of burning plants, they offered fragments of comfort, never a cure. Yet even in such grim exile, not all was despair. With the coming of Christian thought into Viking lands, new places rose for the afflicted. Small halls, known as houses for lepers, were built near churches or at crossroads. Here, those suffering could live together rather than die alone. The leprosaria, though humble, were havens. The sick were fed, often with Viking food brought by kin as offerings, and a priest or chaplain might visit to speak prayers over their broken bodies. In these halls, the outcast became part of a community once more not welcomed back to the heart of the village, but no longer abandoned entirely to the wild. The care was primitive by any measure. Herbs mixed in ale, poultices pressed to skin, salves of lard and ash, all these were common. A healer might burn herbs to drive away the spirits believed to linger in the flesh, or carve charms into wood as a shield against further decay. These methods soothed, but they did not halt the slow march of the disease. The body continued to waste, hands twisted, faces collapsed, and yet within those halls there grew something more enduring, compassion. To tend the leper, to feed him, to pray for him, was seen as a holy act, a service that lifted the soul closer to heaven. Thus, healing in isolation was never truly about the body. It was about the spirit, about granting dignity to those whom fate had marked. A Viking man may have died with sores still upon him, but he did not always die unloved. The Christian priests told them that their suffering mirrored Christ's own, and so many endured their torment with a quiet pride, believing they were earning a place in paradise. In this way, exile was softened, and isolation became a passage, where pain was borne not in shame but in hope. The long dying breath haunted the Viking world, like a shadow in the rafters of the hall. Unlike the swift strike of a sword, or the drowning roar of the sea, this sickness crept slowly, tightening its grip until breath itself became a torment. It was known among many as the wasting disease, for it did not kill at once, but hollowed a Viking man from the inside, leaving him gaunt and pale, his strength withering, until he became but a husk of the warrior he once was. In the longhouses, where fires smoked and voices echoed, the sound of coughing often carried through the night, a grim reminder that death could sit at the hearth as easily as any guest. It began innocently enough, a cough that lingered, a weakness after the day's work, a sweat that drenched the body long after the sun had set. A Viking child might be struck early, his laughter turning to wheezing, his frame shrinking until even the smallest task wearied him. For a Viking woman, already burdened by toil and childbirth, the wasting sickness drained her until her face was sharp with bone, her eyes clouded with fatigue. The disease seemed to gnaw at the very soul, stealing both flesh and breath until only despair remained. The hall itself, with its clay floors and low rafters filled with smoke, was a perfect prison for such an affliction. Fires burned without chimneys, their soot clinging to lungs already weakened. Winter forced families close together, the air thick with coughs and fever. What one man carried in his chest, another soon shared, for the disease passed with a breath, an exhalation, a closeness that was impossible to escape. Thus, a single cough could echo through generations, felling entire kin groups, leaving children without fathers and mothers without sons. The wasting sickness became more feared because of its cruel slowness. A Viking man might linger for months, even years, his body wasting while his mind remained sharp enough to witness his own decline. He might remember the days when he swung his axe with pride, now replaced by trembling hands unable to lift a cup of mead. His kin would sit in silence, listening to the rattle in his chest, knowing that no weapon or shield could turn back what fate had already chosen. Healers tried what they could. Honey was mixed into drinks to soothe the throat. Herbs like angelica and thyme were brewed into bitter teas, and smoke from juniper branches was wafted over the sickbed to cleanse the air. Some believed sleeping under the open sky could restore the lungs, while others prayed to Thor to smash the demon that clutched the chest. Still, the remedies did little more than ease pain. The sickness endured, and the long dying breath stretched on. What made this disease most feared was its betrayal of strength. The strongest Viking warrior could be reduced to a frail shadow, his bones protruding, his eyes sunken, his body racked with coughing until blood stained his lips. Death came not as a sudden blow, but as a gradual surrender, a fading away that left kin helpless. And when at last the breath stopped, it was almost a mercy, for the struggle was ended. The long dying breath was more than sickness. It was a test of endurance, stripping away pride, stripping away flesh, until nothing was left but the will to face fate. In the Viking halls, where courage was prized above all, there was no greater trial than to endure the wasting disease and meet death not with a war cry, but with the quiet rattle of the final breath. The cough of blood was a sound that chilled every Viking hall to silence. It was not the common cough brought on by smoke or winter's chill, but a harsher, deeper rattle that tore from the chest like a death knell. When a Viking man bent forward and crimson stained his lips, fear gripped his kin, for they knew the wasting sickness had tightened its hold. No warrior's shout, no feast song could disguise the dread of that sound. It was the herald of decline, the sign that flesh and breath were slipping away beyond recall. At first, families hoped it might pass. A Viking child's cough could be soothed with honeyed water, a Viking woman's weakness excused as fatigue after toil. But when the cough deepened, when blood appeared in the handkerchief or sprayed upon the rushes of the floor, denial gave way to despair. The sight of blood where it did not belong was thought to be a sign that spirits gnawed at the body from within, or that a curse had been set by some unseen foe. Mothers whispered prayers over their children, men invoked Thor to drive out the evil, but each spasm of bloody breath reminded them how little power they truly held. The symptoms were cruel and relentless. Days were filled with coughing fits so violent that the ribs ached and the head swam with dizziness. Nights were worse. The sick man would lie awake, gasping, his chest rattling like a broken drum, his kin watching helplessly as the fire's glow caught the pale sheen of sweat on his face. Food lost its taste. Viking food, once hearty and filling, could no longer be swallowed, for the body was too weary to take nourishment. Flesh wasted, cheeks hollowed, eyes sank deep into their sockets. The cough of blood drained not only the body, but the spirit of the household, for each cry reminded all who heard it that death was near. Fear spread quickly in such halls. Families dreaded the sound not only for what it meant to the sufferer, but for what it might bring upon them all. The sickness moved with breath, passing unseen from mouth to mouth. A Viking woman who tended her husband could soon find her own lips stained red. A Viking child sleeping near the sickbed might begin to cough within weeks. There was no safety, no true defence, save isolation, and even that often came too late. Healers tried to soothe the terror. Poultices were pressed to the chest, herbs steeped into bitter draughts, charms carved into wood to protect the lungs. Smoke from sacred plants was waved over the body, as if the rising fumes could carry the sickness away, yet no cure was found. The cough of blood always returned, louder, harsher, until the sufferer could do nothing but gasp, choke, and fade. The sound became etched into memory, a reminder of fragility in a world that prized strength. Families who heard it knew their lives were about to change forever. The cough of blood was not merely a symptom, it was a sentence, carried on the breath, echoing through halls where courage alone could not prevail. When the wasting sickness tightened its grip and the cough of blood echoed through the rafters, Viking families turned desperately to charms, smoke, and sacrifice. To them, This was not merely an illness of the body, it was an affliction born of spirits, a curse laid upon the chest, and it demanded both healing hands and the favour of the gods. A Viking man might face battle without fear, yet when breath rattled in his lungs and crimson stained his lips, his courage faltered, for no sword could cut down such an unseen foe. The only weapons left were faith, ritual, and the ancient wisdom of healers who carried memory older than the sagas. The first defence was always the charm. Healers carved runes of protection into smooth stones or strips of bone, marking them with signs said to summon Odin's wisdom or Thor's strength. These were worn around the neck or placed by the sickbed, their power believed to drive the sickness from the body. A Viking child who struggled to breathe might have runes etched into a piece of driftwood, dipped in ale, and given to him to swallow, an act of mingling magic with nourishment. Charms were whispered too, words passed down through generations. Spoken over the chest of the sick, they were thought to weave invisible shields, binding the illness and forcing it to loosen its grip. Smoke was another weapon, for the air itself was seen as both the carrier of sickness and its cure. Juniper branches, angelica, and mugwort were thrown upon the fire, their fragrant smoke filling the hall. The sick were made to inhale deeply, coughing as the fumes seared their throats, in the hope that the evil within would be expelled with the breath. Sometimes the smoke was wafted over the body with feathers, as though sweeping away unseen spirits. A Viking woman, her strength failing after nights of fever, might lie wrapped in blankets while smoke billowed around her, her kin chanting to ward off the shadow of death. The hall stank of burning herbs, thick and bitter, yet for those who believed, it was the very breath of the gods entering the body to cleanse it. When charms and smoke failed, sacrifice remained. The wasting sickness was seen as a punishment or a trial sent by higher powers, and offerings were made to win back favour. A goat or sheep might be slaughtered at the edge of the settlement, its blood poured upon the earth with prayers to Freya for mercy, or to Thor to smash the demon clutched around the lungs. In darker times, when despair hung heavy, some whispered of giving a thrall to the gods, his life exchanged for the life of the sick. Such acts were rare, but the desperation of a Viking family watching a father or child fade could drive them to the edge of hope and horror alike. Yet despite charms, smoke, and sacrifice, the wasting sickness often triumphed. The runes cracked, the herbs withered, and the gods remained silent. Still, these rituals gave meaning to the struggle. They reminded the Vikings that even in the face of an invisible killer, they were not entirely powerless. They fought with what they had: faith, fire, and the will to endure. To die after such rites was not to die abandoned, but to pass on having battled fate itself with every breath. And in a world where courage was the highest virtue, even such a death was met with grim honour. The stench of death was not always born from the battlefield. In Viking villages, it rose from the very earth beneath their feet, from the foul water they drank, and the filth that gathered where men and beasts lived side by side. Dysentery, the rotting of the gut, was a scourge that claimed countless lives without drawing a blade. It thrived where famine weakened the body, where tainted food and water carried poison into the stomach, and where no hearth or hall was safe from the spread of decay. The smell of sickness clung to the air, a heavy reminder that death often crept not with sword or storm, but with a whisper from within. The Viking longhouse, strong against winter's winds, was less a fortress against disease. Rushes laid on the floor caught spittle, dung, and the drippings of Viking food. Rats scurried in the shadows, their droppings mixed with scraps of fish and meat. Water, drawn from streams that carried the refuse of animals, was swallowed by thirsty men and women, its foulness invisible until the gut twisted in agony. Once struck, a Viking man would clutch his belly as cramps racked him, rushing outside only to collapse in the mud, overcome with sickness. His kin would watch in horror as strength poured from him as swiftly as water. For Viking children, the danger was even greater. Small bodies could not endure the endless purging of dysentery. A child once lively, laughing at the games by the fjord, could be reduced in days to a ghost, lips dry, eyes hollow, too weak even to cry. Viking women, striving to keep families fed in times of famine, often ate spoiled food when no other choice remained. They too became prey to the gut rot, their bodies drained until life slipped away before the harvest could come. The disease was merciless in its swiftness. Fever burned, bowels emptied with blood, and the body shriveled like a husk. The hall reeked of sickness, the rushes soaked with foulness, and no fire was strong enough to drive away the stench. Families fled from one another, fearing the taint in every breath, yet often it was too late. Entire households might fall, struck not by an enemy's axe, but by poisoned water and the filth they could never fully escape. Healers fought with what little they knew. They brewed broths of herbs, mixing yarrow and angelica into boiling water, praying it might strengthen the body. Honey was stirred into drinks to soothe the gut, while prayers were spoken to call upon divine mercy. Sometimes ashes were mixed into ale, thought to burn away the corruption. But more often than not, these remedies could not stem the wasting, and the sick wasted into shadows before their kin's eyes. The stench of death from dysentery haunted every Viking village, lingering long after the sick had been buried. It reminded them that courage in battle was but one kind of valour, and that survival itself demanded endurance against foes unseen. In the end, gut rot was as deadly as any spear, a silent enemy that struck in the heart of hearth and hall, proving that even the strongest Viking man or the proudest Viking woman was never beyond the reach of fate. When the gut betrays, there is no warning, no mercy. A Viking man who had feasted heartily on fish, bread, and mead at night might wake before dawn with his belly twisting like a knot of serpents. The strength that once powered the oars or swung the axe could be drained away in hours, as waves of pain bent him double, and foul water poured from his body until he was left trembling in weakness. To the Viking mind, this was no simple sickness. It was the body turning against itself, a betrayal as cruel as treachery on the battlefield. Food was both life and danger in those times. Viking food was stored through harsh winters, salted, dried, or buried in earth pits. When hunger gnawed and famine pressed close, no scrap was wasted, even when rot and mould crept into it. Spoiled grain carried poisons unseen, fish left too long in the sun grew foul, and meat from sickly animals still found its way to the pot. Families prayed that the gods would shield them, but prayers did not always guard the stomach. A single meal could turn to poison, laying low not one man but a whole household. The sickness struck with fury. A Viking child, frail from hunger, might begin with a stomachache, but soon be writhing in pain, his body emptied until only blood marked his passing. Viking women often bore the heaviest burden, for they ate last, ensuring their kin were fed first. What scraps remained for them were often the worst, riddled with spoilage. Many fell, weakened beyond recovery, their deaths a quiet reminder of sacrifice. The betrayal of the gut was swift and cruel, stealing those who could least endure it. Villages stank when the disease took hold. The rushes of the longhouse were fouled, the air heavy with the smell of waste and sweat. No fire could mask it. The cries of the sick echoed through the night, broken only by silence when exhaustion overcame them. Families huddled in fear, not only of losing their kin, but of sharing the same fate, for no one could know if the food they swallowed that day would sustain them or destroy them. Healers sought remedies, though their weapons were weak. Bitter herbs were boiled into broth to steady the stomach. Honey was mixed with ash or charcoal and given as a draught, thought to absorb the poison. Warm stones were pressed to bellies, and charms were sung over the sick, pleading with unseen spirits to release their hold. At times, fasting was demanded, though hunger already gripped every household. The sick endured with courage, yet often, despite all efforts, the gut's betrayal ended in death. This sickness was feared not only for its cruelty but for its dishonour. To die on the battlefield was to be remembered in song, but to die doubled over in filth was a fate unspoken, a shame carried only in whispers. And yet, such was the reality of Viking life. The betrayal of the gut was another reminder that strength was fleeting, that even the mightiest Viking man or the most resilient Viking woman could be undone not by axe or storm, but by the treachery of the food they depended upon to live. Ashes, herbs, and ale became the fragile weapons with which the Vikings fought against the unseen enemy that rotted their bellies. When the gut seized with cramps and the body poured itself out in sickness, families turned to the old knowledge carried by healers and whispered in the smoke of longhouses. To the Viking mind, disease was not only the work of foul food or tainted water, but the curse of spirits that lurked unseen. To drive them away, they called upon the earth, the flame, and the drink that warmed their hearts, turning common things into shields of hope. Ash was often the first remedy. From the hearth fires that burned day and night, ashes were gathered and mixed into water or ale, then swallowed by the sick. The bitter grit scraped the tongue, but it was thought to burn away the poison lodged in the stomach. A Viking man writhing on the rushes might be forced to drink until his body rejected the foul mixture, vomiting forth what was believed to be the demon of sickness itself. Sometimes charcoal from burnt wood was ground into powder and stirred into broth, given to Viking children who could no longer eat. Though the taste was foul, families clung to the belief that ash could cleanse the gut as fire cleansed the world. Herbs were the next line of defence, gathered from forest, field, and fjord. Angelica, prized for its strength against fevers, was brewed into teas to steady the stomach. Yarrow leaves were crushed into poultices and pressed upon the belly to draw out pain. Garlic, sharp and burning, was swallowed whole or boiled with milk, its pungent power thought to drive away corruption. Healers carried bundles of mugwort, fennel, and juniper, waving them in smoke over the sick to chase away the spirits gnawing at their insides. In the dim light of the longhouse, the air grew thick with the reek of herbs, while the sick groaned and their kin prayed that the cure would take hold. Ale, beloved in feast and firelight, also became medicine. A Viking woman would warm it with honey, mixing in herbs or even ground bone to strengthen the body. The sick were urged to sip slowly to restore strength and spirit. At times, the ale was mixed with blood from a sacrificed animal, given as a sacred draught in the hope that life would answer life. Though ale alone could not cure the gut's betrayal, it offered warmth to the failing, comfort to the weary, and courage to those who feared the slow death of wasting. Yet these remedies were as uncertain as the turning of seasons. Some recovered, their strength returning after days of suffering, while others wasted away despite every charm, herb, and draught. But still the Vikings fought, for to do nothing was to surrender to fate without honour. Ashes, herbs, and ale became their weapons, not against warriors in mail, but against the unseen corruption that turned strong men into shadows and robbed children of their laughter. In this struggle, they showed the same courage they carried into battle, facing the darkness within with grit, faith, and the stubborn will to endure. The speckled plague was a terror that scarred both flesh and memory across the Viking lands. Unlike the sudden violence of axe or sword, this sickness crept silently into villages, spreading from one hearth to the next, leaving behind not only death, but faces forever marked by its touch. The Vikings feared many things: famine, storms, betrayal, but smallpox carved its place among their greatest enemies. Its scars became known as a brand of fate, reminders that even the strongest Viking man or the bravest Viking woman could not escape the hand of unseen doom. It began with a fever that burned like fire in the blood. A Viking child would shiver beneath blankets, his body drenched in sweat, while his mother whispered prayers to Freya for mercy. Soon the rash would rise, first as small red spots across the face and arms, then spreading until the whole body was covered in angry blisters. These swelled with pus, bursting and crusting, leaving skin raw and painful to the touch. The cries of the afflicted filled the longhouse, echoing louder than the clash of any battle. For many, the suffering lasted days before death came, merciful only in its release. The disease struck without regard for station. A Viking king seated in his high hall, feasting on meat and mead, might find himself as vulnerable as the thrall who tended his cattle. The speckled plague cared nothing for wealth, strength, or fame. Entire households fell in its wake, their fires extinguished, their halls abandoned. For those who survived, life was forever altered. The disease did not leave quietly. It carved itself into the skin, leaving deep-pitted scars upon the face and body. A Viking woman, once famed for beauty, might be left unrecognizable. A Viking man who had dreamed of glory might be forever marked, his visage twisted by the plague's cruel hand. Survivors were often shunned, seen as living reminders of the gods' punishment. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. The sight of speckled skin filled neighbours with dread, and many turned away from the afflicted, believing them cursed. Families sometimes carried their kin outside the village, leaving them in huts or shelters beyond the fields, their moans carried on the wind. Healers came armed with herbs, chanting runes, and mixing bitter draughts of garlic, honey, and ash, but few cures offered true relief. Fires were stoked, halls filled with smoke, to drive out the spirits believed to dwell in the blisters, but the speckled plague paid little heed to charms or flame. What made the disease most feared was its power to linger. A Viking child who survived might carry the scars into adulthood, a face marked forever, a tale written in flesh that no saga could erase. These scars were more than blemishes, they were warnings, reminders that the god's hand could strike at any time, leaving even the survivors branded. Families bore these marks with sorrow, knowing that beauty, strength, and even honour could be stripped away in an instant. The speckled plague was not simply a disease, it was a shadow over every hearth, a terror that did not fade with time. In Viking lands, where courage was sung and strength admired, smallpox left a cruel legacy. It scarred the face of men and women, scarred the memory of children who watched their kin suffer, and scarred the spirit of entire villages. It was not a warrior's death, but it was a battlefield all the same, and the scars it left behind were as much a mark of fate as any blade. Burned skin and blinding light, such was the cruel mark of smallpox upon the Viking people. The sickness did not simply strike and pass, it seared itself into flesh and memory. When the rash of the speckled plague swelled into blisters, the skin of a Viking man seemed as though it had been pressed to fire. Faces swelled, eyes watered, and the agony of touch turned even the soft brush of cloth into torment. The longhouse, once filled with the smell of Viking food roasting on the fire, now stank of sickness, of pus and sweat, of decay that clung to every corner. The afflicted writhed upon their beds, caught between fever and shivering cold, and their kin could only watch as the disease devoured them. The first torment was the skin itself. What began as spots soon rose into hard pustules, packed so close together that no inch of flesh seemed spared. They burned as though hot coals had been laid across the body, a fire that raged both outside and within. A Viking child would scratch at his face until blood streaked down his cheeks, while his mother tied his hands to keep him from tearing his own skin. The blisters would burst, leaking foul fluid, then scab and harden, only to crack open again. No warrior's wound was ever so relentless, for a wound of battle could heal. The plague's fire lingered, burning until the body collapsed from exhaustion. Then came the blinding light. The eyes were not spared by the sickness. Red, swollen, and streaming with pus, they clouded over until sight failed. A Viking woman who once gazed across the fjord, watching her children play by the shore, might find only darkness in her last days. For survivors, blindness often remained, leaving them forever dependent on kin. In a world where every hand was needed for work and every eye for watchfulness, to lose sight was to become a burden, a cruel twist for those who had once been strong. Survival was possible, but it was survival with scars. A Viking man might live, yet the disease would carve his face into a map of pits and hollows, branding him so that no stranger could fail to see what he had endured. Many who survived were shunned or pitied, seen as both blessed and cursed. Blessed to have lived, cursed to carry the mark of the plague. Viking children who outlasted the fever grew into adults with twisted skin and weak eyes, reminders in every village that the gods gave no victory without cost. Healers tried what little they could. Cool cloths were pressed to burning skin, herbs brewed into bitter teas to ease the fever, charms sung over swollen eyes in the hope of saving sight. Yet, these were frail shields against a foe so merciless. In truth, survival often depended on the strength of the body and the weaving of fate by the Norns. Burned skin and blinding light were the legacies of smallpox, and they left their mark upon every hall they touched. They taught the Vikings that even the strongest warrior could be unmade by fire that burned from within, and that survival itself could bring a new kind of torment. For in the end, those who lived carried the scars of the plague as surely as those who died carried it to the grave. They called it the trial of Odin's fire, for when the speckled plague took hold and a Viking man burned with fever, it seemed as though the All-Father himself had set flame to his blood. The disease seared through the body, leaving blistered skin and failing eyes, and in the face of such torment, the Vikings turned not only to herbs and salves, but to the old rituals that bound them to their gods. Prayer became medicine, sacrifice became remedy, and the smoke of sacred fires rose from longhouses and groves alike, carrying desperate pleas to the heavens. When a Viking child burned with fever, and his skin bloomed with angry pustules, his mother might wrap him in furs and whisper charms, taught by her own mother before her. These were words not of healing alone, but of summoning protection, binding the sickness with the power of runes. A piece of driftwood, carved with the marks of Thor's hammer, might be placed by the child's bed, while drops of ale were poured upon the earth to appease the unseen spirits believed to stalk the sick. In such moments, the line between cure and prayer was blurred, for the people believed both were needed to endure Odin's fire. The rituals carried power not through certainty of healing, but through the strength they gave to those who waited and watched. A Viking woman, tending her husband, might grind garlic and honey into a bitter paste for his sores, while singing to Freya for mercy, asking the goddess of fertility and love to spare the bonds of family. Smoke was a constant ally, juniper branches thrown upon the fire to cleanse the air, herbs burned until the hall was heavy with scent. The sick would breathe deeply of the smoke, coughing as though the illness itself was being driven from their lungs, while kin fanned the fumes over their bodies, believing it to be the god's breath. Sacrifice was the final plea, the cost of survival offered in blood. A goat, an ox, even a treasured horse might be given at the sacred grove, its lifeblood spilled while the family knelt in prayer. To the Vikings, such offerings were not cruelty, but exchange, life for life, strength for strength. A Viking man who recovered after such rites was seen as blessed by the gods, his scars carried with pride, as proof he had passed through Odin's fire and returned. But for many, the sacrifice did not bring healing, only the comfort that nothing had been left undone. In truth, the rituals and prayers did little to cure the speckled plague. The fire still burned, the eyes still dimmed, and the scars still marked those who lived. Yet they gave meaning to the suffering, binding the sick and their kin together in faith and defiance. To endure the trial of Odin's fire was not only to face disease, but to stand firm before the will of fate, knowing that every prayer spoken, every sacrifice given, was a testament to courage. And if death came, it was faced not with silence, but with the echoes of ritual, the whispers of kin, and the belief that the gods themselves bore witness to their trial. They feared it as a fire that burned from within, a torment that twisted flesh and mind alike. In the north, where rye was the grain that filled the bellies of farmer and warrior alike, the hidden curse of ergot took root. The Vikings did not know its true cause, that damp-stored rye carried a dark fungus, but they knew well the agony it brought. They called it St. Anthony's fire, though in their tongue it was often whispered as a punishment, a sign of wrath from gods or spirits. It was a sickness that struck without warning, creeping from their very food, turning the blessing of harvest into a curse that seared the body and clouded the mind. A Viking man, strong from days of labour in field and forge, might sit to eat the bread baked from his own stores, unaware that the grain within it bore poison. Hours later, his body would convulse, his limbs twisting beyond his control. His hands and feet burned as though pressed to glowing iron, the blood in his veins seeming to freeze even as fire licked at his skin. Some felt the slow rot of gangrene, their toes blackening, until they dropped away. Others were seized by visions and madness, stumbling through the village as if the spirits of hell had already claimed them. For Viking children, the fire was no less cruel. A simple meal of porridge could set their small bodies aflame with fever, their cries piercing the longhouse as their mothers tried in vain to soothe them. Some believed the children were bewitched, their fits the sign of sorcery cast by jealous neighbours or wandering vulva. Smoke and charms were called upon to drive the curse away, but the fire raged within, uncaring of chants or prayers. Families despaired, torn between hunger and the risk of poisoned grain, for to throw away food in times of scarcity was itself a kind of death. Viking women bore the burden heavily, for it was they who often tended the stores of rye and baked the bread. If the grain was damp or tainted, it was not always seen until sickness struck. They would weep as their husbands withered, their children shook in seizures, knowing that what should have sustained their kin had betrayed them. Guilt was mingled with grief, though none truly understood the hidden hand behind the fire. The disease came in waves, sometimes sparing a village, sometimes claiming dozens. When the fits of madness swept through the afflicted, whole groups could be seen writhing, dancing uncontrollably in the fields, as if possessed by unseen forces. Tales of these dancing plagues spread across generations, remembered with dread. Some saw them as omens of Ragnarok itself, a sign that the order of the world was unravelling. To fight such horror, Vikings turned to the only means they knew. Ale was mixed with herbs to dull the pain, charms carved into wood were hung above the beds of the stricken, and sacrifices were offered to Thor or Freya in hopes of mercy. Yet St. Anthony's fire cared little for these acts. It was born of their own bread, their own harvest, and it consumed them from within, leaving blackened flesh, broken minds, and sorrowful halls in its wake. Thus, the very grain that gave life to the Viking world also carried death. St. Anthony's fire in the north was not the blaze of battle, but a slow, merciless burning, a reminder that even the food on the table could be a weapon of fate. It branded those it touched with pain and madness, turning every meal into a gamble between life and fire. The dance of madness was a sight that haunted Viking villages, a terror unlike any wound or fever. It came without warning, seizing the body and mind, twisting them into a grotesque display of convulsions and visions. A Viking man who had once strode proudly into battle could be seen staggering like a drunkard, his limbs jerking as if pulled by unseen strings. His eyes rolled back, his mouth foamed, and he laughed or screamed at shadows no one else could see. To his kin, it was as though spirits had taken hold of him, dragging him into a world between life and hell. At times, it swept through groups, leaving entire gatherings stricken. A Viking child might fall into fits after eating rye bread, his small body shaking so violently that his parents believed he was possessed. Soon after, others in the hall would join him, swaying, thrashing, even leaping, as if caught in a wild dance. The village would watch in dread as their kin writhed in unison, chanting or shrieking words that made no sense. It was not the joyful circle dance of feast days, but a frenzy of madness driven by something far darker. The visions that followed were no less terrifying. Some saw fire licking at their hands and feet, though no flame touched them. Others claimed to see giants looming over the fjord, or the dead walking among the living. A Viking woman, stricken with the madness, might speak to unseen beings, her voice rising and falling in eerie tones until her strength gave out. To those who witnessed it, such sights were proof of sorcery, a curse cast by enemies, or a punishment from the gods for sins unspoken. Healers struggled to contain the chaos. They burned herbs of mugwort and juniper, waving the smoke over the stricken in hopes of driving out the spirits that danced within their bodies. Runes of protection were carved into wood and stone, pressed into trembling hands, or tied around necks. Ale laced with bitter herbs was forced upon the sufferers, though many spat it out, lost in delirium. Families prayed to Odin for wisdom, to Thor for strength, and to Freya for mercy, but often the prayers were drowned by the shrieks of the afflicted. In the worst cases, the dance ended not in exhaustion, but in death. Muscles locked, jaws clenched, breath ceased, and the body fell limp at last. Others survived, but with minds forever altered, haunted by visions they could not forget. Some wandered into the forests, muttering to themselves, never to return. Others bore twisted hands and feet, crippled by the convulsions that had racked them. The dance of madness struck terror deeper than many plagues, for it robbed its victims not only of strength but of dignity. To see a Viking warrior reduced to a puppet of unseen forces was to witness the breaking of human will itself. Villages remembered such outbreaks for years, speaking in hushed tones of the nights when their kin were driven to dance until death. Thus, the dance of madness was more than a sickness. It was a reminder of how thin the line was between order and chaos, strength and ruin. It showed the Vikings that even the fiercest warrior, even the most faithful mother, could be snatched into a frenzy where body and soul no longer obeyed. And in that cruel dance, they saw not only sickness, but a glimpse of the abyss that lay just beyond the firelight. Cures worse than the curse. Such was the cruel fate of those struck by the fire of poisoned grain in the Viking world. The sickness that came from tainted rye was relentless, twisting limbs, burning flesh, and driving men to madness. Yet the remedies sought in desperation were often as grim as the affliction itself. A Viking man who stumbled with convulsions, or a Viking child whose small hands turned black with gangrene, might be given treatments so harsh, so strange, that death itself seemed kinder. For in their ignorance of the true cause, families and healers clutched at remedies that promised hope but delivered further torment. One such remedy was the feeding of prisoners with the cursed grain. The afflicted grain, once recognized as dangerous, was sometimes set aside not for disposal, but for those whose lives were deemed expendable. In dark corners of jails, thralls and captives were given the mould-stained rye, their bodies sacrificed for a different purpose. The urine of these unfortunate souls grew sour and sharp, and it was prized in the tanning of hides, believed to hold special potency. The prisoners themselves wasted away, their flesh consumed by the same fire, their deaths ignored as necessity. Thus the sickness was not only a curse of the body, but a cruelty of survival, where even human suffering was turned into labour. Among families who sought to save their own, remedies were no less grim. Urine itself was thought to carry cleansing power. A Viking woman might be instructed to drink her own, or that of another, believing it would purge the body of poison. At times, sores were bathed in it, the acrid sting seen as a sign of healing. To the sick, already writhing with pain, this cure brought no relief, only further misery, but desperation left them no choice. Other remedies carried the same hopeless brutality. Salves of lard mixed with ashes were smeared upon blackened limbs, while foul-smelling poultices of mould and herbs, were pressed to burning sores. Ale, beloved in feast and fellowship, was corrupted with powders of bone or soot, forced down the throats of the delirious in hopes of driving out the fire within. Smoke of burning plants filled the halls until eyes watered and lungs choked, but the sickness remained, mocking every effort. A Viking child might be made to swallow herbs so bitter they brought only vomiting, while a Viking man was cut and bled, his lifeblood drained to balance the humours that healers believed had turned foul. These cures did not banish the curse. The sores still blackened, the limbs still shriveled, the visions still plagued the mind. To try, even with remedies as dreadful as the disease, was to show love, to fight against fate with every scrap of knowledge and will. But the truth was merciless. The cures themselves often hastened death, leaving the afflicted weaker, broken not only by sickness, but by the very hands that sought to heal them. Such was the tragedy of the Viking struggle with poisoned grain, that in fighting the fire they sometimes fed it, leaving behind only sorrow, scars, and the bitter memory of cures worse than the curse. Black boils in the fjord, such was the terror that stalked the Viking lands when the plague first crept upon their shores. It did not announce itself with the clash of steel or the roar of storm, but with silence, with rats in the shadows of ships, with fleas hidden in the seams of cargo and grain. A Viking ship that returned triumphant from trade or raid might carry silver, slaves, and spices, but it also carried death. From the harbours of the north to the fjords, where families gathered to greet their kin, the pestilence came, and with it a fear no warrior could strike down. The first signs were small, almost unnoticed. A fever in the night, a sudden weakness in a Viking man who had once swung his axe with ease, a weariness in a Viking woman who had worked the fields from dawn. But then the swellings came dark lumps beneath the armpits, in the groin, on the neck. They grew into black boils, hard and searing, filled with pus and blood. When they burst, the stench was foul, and the sight was enough to chill the bravest heart. Families drew back in horror, yet it was too late, for by the time the boils appeared, death was already near. The fjords, once alive with the sound of oars and laughter of children, became haunted by silence. The cries of the sick echoed through the longhouses, followed by the silence of death. A Viking child, once running freely across the meadows, might be struck down in days, his body racked with fever, his skin marked with the black bruise of plague. Viking food, no matter how rich or plentiful, could not restore strength to bodies consumed by fever. Even the strongest warriors wasted quickly, their final days filled with delirium, spasms, and blood coughed from failing lungs. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. Villages whispered of curses, of the wrath of Loki, or the vengeance of restless spirits. Smoke from fires filled the air as herbs were burned to drive away the plague's demons. Charms were carved into bone and stone, prayers shouted into the night, but the black boils paid no heed. The disease moved from hall to hall, sparing no family, until even the skalds fell silent, their voices lost to fever. The fjords bore witness to mass burials, graves filled not with honoured warriors, but with farmers, children, and wives all taken before their time. So many died that there were not enough hands to bury them. Bodies were laid in pits, covered with earth in haste, without the rites the Vikings held sacred. For a people who believed that death in battle brought honour, to die so helplessly was a wound to the spirit as well as the flesh. The plague was unlike any foe the Vikings had faced. Swords could not cleave it, shields could not turn it. It seeped into their homes, their food, their very breath, leaving only sorrow in its path. Black boils in the fjord became a symbol of despair, a mark of a time when even the fierce courage of the north could not withstand the hand of fate. The rat and the raven, two creatures bound to the story of the plague's terror in Viking lands. The raven, long a symbol of omen and death, circled above the villages where smoke rose from funeral pyres. The rat, small and unseen, crept through longhouses, ships, and storehouses, carrying with it the true hand of doom. Between them lay the tale of how infection swept across seas and fjords, how bustling markets and proud halls were brought to silence by a foe that spread as swiftly as whispers in the dark. It began with the ships. A Viking man returning from distant trade brought not only silver, silk, or spices, but grain infested with fleas, rats hidden in the shadows of barrels, and with them the invisible seeds of plague. As the longships cut through the fjords, families gathered to welcome their kin, never knowing that death crouched in the holds. The rats leapt ashore, slipping into barns and kitchens, where Viking food lay piled in storage. The fleas bit man and beast alike, passing the sickness into blood, and within days the first fevers began. Once in the towns, the plague spread like fire in dry grass. The crowded longhouses were perfect breeding grounds. Dozens of souls slept side by side, the air thick with smoke and sweat. One cough became another, one fever turned to 10, and soon whole households were stricken. A Viking child, nestled close to his mother, might fall ill after a single night, his skin blooming with black boils before his father even understood the danger. Rats scurried boldly across the rushes, feeding on scraps of meat and fish, thriving in the filth that gathered in every corner. Their presence was constant, a reminder that the unseen enemy moved with them. The raven's role was more symbolic, but no less real. Villages saw the blackbirds gathering in greater numbers, feasting upon corpses left unburied when death struck too swiftly for proper rites. To the Viking mind, the raven was Odin's companion, a messenger of fate, and its arrival in great flocks seemed to confirm that the gods themselves had marked the land for suffering. People looked to the skies in dread, their hearts sinking at the sight of wings circling above their dying kin. The rats spread the plague, but the raven proclaimed it, its cries echoing over empty fields and silent fjords. Fear fractured communities. Some fled into the forests, abandoning their sick kin to escape the contagion. Others sealed themselves in halls, burning herbs to ward off the foulness. Yet still the plague found them. It spread not only by rat and flea, but through breath and touch, carried by the closeness of Viking life. Every feast, every gathering, every journey of trade became another link in the chain of death. Thus, the rat and the raven became twin symbols of ruin. One brought the sickness into the blood, the other declared its triumph over the living. Together they told the tale of how infection crept silently through ships and towns, until even the strongest Viking man or the proudest Viking woman was brought low, and the sound of oars upon the fjord gave way to the silence of death. The silence of the thing was a silence that chilled the soul. Where once voices had risen in debate, where Viking men gathered in circles to settle disputes and speak law beneath the open sky, now there was nothing but stillness. The plague had swept through the land with merciless speed, and the gatherings that bound the people together fell mute. Villages that had thrived for generations were emptied in weeks, their halls left hollow, their hearths cold. It was as if the gods themselves had abandoned Midgard, leaving only shadows and ash in their wake. The thing was more than a council, it was the heart of Viking life. There, Viking farmers, warriors, and chieftains met as equals, raising matters of land, kinship, and trade. The air would once be filled with the murmur of voices, the laughter of Viking children playing at the edge of the crowd, the smell of Viking food cooking over fires as men and women shared news and stories. But when the plague came, those sounds vanished. The places where hundreds had gathered stood empty, overgrown with weeds, the wooden poles that marked the assembly leaning in silence. The suddenness of death was the most terrifying. A man who had spoken at the thing 1 week might be gone the next, his household scattered or buried in haste. Neighbours who once argued fiercely over borders of land now lay side by side in mass graves, their voices forever stilled. The rhythm of the community, once kept alive by speech and song, was broken. No one dared gather, for gatherings meant death, and the very strength of the thing, the closeness of many, had become a curse. The sight of whole villages deserted was a wound upon the land itself. Longhouses stood open to the wind, their doors swinging, fires long extinguished. Tools lay scattered where they had been dropped, looms half woven, axes left lodged in wood. In some halls, the bodies of entire families remained where they had fallen, too many to bury, their silence more dreadful than any battlefield. Ravens circled above these ghostly places, and wolves prowled near, emboldened by the absence of men. To pass through such a village was to feel the weight of the plague in every empty corner. The silence did not fall only on the dead. Those who lived remained trapped in fear, their voices hushed, their gatherings forbidden by their own dread. Even disputes that would have once raged were left unspoken. Better to suffer injustice in silence than to risk the spread of sickness. Better to endure alone than to gather and invite doom. Thus the very foundation of the thing, the spirit of law and kinship, was broken, and with it the order of the Viking world. The silence of the thing was more than absence of sound, it was the shattering of unity. It revealed how fragile the bonds of community could be when faced with death's swift hand. The Vikings, who once prided themselves on courage and defiance, now saw their villages hollowed, their gatherings silenced, their lives unravelled by an enemy they could neither fight nor see. And in that silence lay the most dreadful truth, that no hall, no law, no voice could stand against the plague when it came to claim its due. The fever that strikes at night was a thief of strength and sanity, creeping into Viking halls like a shadow none could keep out. By day, a Viking man might seem sound enough, able to tend his cattle or swing his axe, though his brow glistened with sweat. But when darkness fell, the sickness revealed its true cruelty. Shivering fits seized the body, teeth clattered like stones struck together, and the chill sank so deep it seemed the very bones were turning to ice. Then, as suddenly as the cold came, a burning heat would follow, as though Odin's own fire had been poured into the veins. The night became a battlefield between frost and flame, and the victim, trapped between both, could do nothing but endure. Families dreaded the setting of the sun, for they knew what it brought. A Viking child, playful during the day despite pallor and weariness, might collapse into convulsions once darkness wrapped the hall. Mothers laid furs upon their children, only to strip them away moments later as the fever scorched the skin. Viking women whispered charms into the smoky air, begging Freya for mercy, while men poured cold water over the stricken, in hopes of driving the fire out. The night rang with cries and groans, a chorus of suffering that left the whole household restless and afraid. No season spared them, though the fevers were worst in damp places, where water pooled near farms and insects bred unseen. Viking food grew from fields tended beside such waters, and many believed it was not just the land that yielded its harvest, but also the sickness that came with it. Some thought it was the bite of cursed creatures, unseen in the dusk, that carried the fever into blood. Others said it was a punishment sent by angry spirits, their wrath felt in every shiver and burning flush. Whatever its cause, the people feared it greatly, for the fever returned again and again, each night, stealing more of the body's strength, until only weakness remained. Healers sought to break the cycle with herbs and smoke. They brewed bitter draughts of wormwood, angelica, and garlic, forcing the sick to drink, though their stomachs turned. Juniper branches were burned in the hearth, their smoke drawn over the body to cleanse it. Some placed heated stones at the feet, then doused them in water to fill the hall with steam, hoping the sweat would drive out the spirits of illness. Others carved protective runes into wood, pressing them against the chest of the afflicted, believing that words of power could bind the fever and keep it from returning with the night. Yet, more often than not, the fever lingered, rising with each dusk, loosening its grip only when dawn broke. A Viking man wasted away after weeks of torment, his muscles shrinking, his strength gone, until even walking became a struggle. Children rarely survived many such nights. Their small bodies could not endure the constant war of frost and fire. The fever that strikes at night was a cruel reminder of how fragile life remained, even for a people hardened by sea and storm. It stole silently, without blade or battle, and left only hollowed bodies and grief. And though the Vikings fought it with charms, herbs, and stubborn will, the fever often claimed its due, proving that not even the fiercest courage could always outlast the darkness. Sweating sickness in the hall was a terror unlike any other, for it gave no warning, no slow decline, but struck with the speed of a storm. A Viking man might rise at dawn, strong and hearty, breaking his fast with bread and dried fish, and by nightfall he would be dead, his body drenched in sweat, his breath stolen in violent gasps. Unlike the wasting diseases that hollowed men over weeks, this sickness claimed its victims in a single day, leaving households stunned, unable to comprehend how swiftly life had been extinguished. The first sign was sudden unease. A Viking child might complain of aching limbs or a pain in the head, his laughter replaced by weariness. Then came the fever, a heat that flooded the body and drenched the skin. Sweat poured in torrents, soaking furs, rushes, and bedding until the stench of sickness filled the hall. The victim tossed and turned, unable to rest, his heart pounding so violently it seemed it would burst. Some collapsed within hours, their strength drained as though life itself had been wrung from them. The swiftness of the disease filled every household with dread. A Viking woman might serve food to her kin at midday, only to see one of them fall into fever before the meal was finished, and by night she would be mourning at his side. No battle, no raid, no storm at sea had ever carried death with such speed. Families huddled together, fearful of every cough, every bead of sweat, every sign that the sickness had taken hold. The hall itself became a place of horror. Where once smoke and laughter rose, now only groans and cries echoed. Bodies lay slick with sweat, their skin pale and clammy, their eyes wide with fear. The rushes beneath them grew sodden, the air heavy with the rank smell of death. No herb or charm seemed strong enough, no sacrifice sufficient. Healers could do little more than wipe the sweat away and pray to the gods for mercy. The strangeness of the sickness made it all the more frightening. Infants and elders often seemed untouched, while strong Viking men in their prime, those who rowed the longships and fought with axe in hand, fell swiftly. This baffled families, for it was the very heart of the household, the workers, the defenders, the fathers and brothers who were most often claimed. The loss left villages broken, with women and children forced to take up burdens they were not meant to bear. Some said the sweating sickness was the wrath of Loki, his mischief turned deadly, striking the proudest to remind all of their fragility. Others whispered of a curse carried across the seas, a foreign evil that had crept into their lands through trade or raid. Whatever its cause, the terror it spread was greater than any foe met on the battlefield, for it could claim a hall in a single day and leave nothing but silence behind. Sweating sickness in the hall was remembered as a swift and merciless shadow, a sickness that robbed families of their strength before they had time to grieve. It was a cruel lesson that even in a world of warriors, where courage was prized above all, no shield could turn aside the hand of fate when it struck so suddenly. When wounds fester, death does not come with the strike of a blade or the pangs of childbirth alone, but with the slow creeping of rot through the veins. The Vikings, for all their courage in war and toil, feared this hidden enemy more than the flash of steel. A Viking man could stand proudly upon the battlefield, cutting down his foes, only to find in the days that followed that the smallest gash upon his arm betrayed him. A Viking woman could endure the agony of bringing forth life, only to feel fever and weakness overtake her body until she too was claimed. Sepsis was the silent curse, the corruption that followed victory and birth alike, mocking all human strength. The battlefield was its favoured ground. After a raid or skirmish, longhouses filled with the groans of the wounded. Men lay upon benches, their wounds bound with cloth, their kin hopeful for recovery. Yet too often the cuts, once clean, grew foul. Flesh swelled, turning red and hot, oozing pus that stank of decay. The wounded grew feverish, their minds wandering, their breath shallow. A Viking man who had fought like a hero might soon lie, shaking like a child, powerless before the unseen hand that dragged him toward death. His comrades, untouched by steel, watched helplessly as he wasted, whispering that Nidhugger, the serpent of hell, was gnawing at him from within. For Viking women, the danger came in the birthing bed. Childbirth was already a perilous trial, but when the blood that flowed gave way to fever and corruption, there was little hope. Mothers who had survived the ordeal of labour often grew pale, their bodies burning with heat, their wounds reeking of infection. The joy of a new Viking child was soon shadowed by grief, as families realised the mother would not rise again. Her passing was mourned not only as a loss of life, but as a blow to the kin, for every woman was the hearth fire of her household, her absence leaving a cold emptiness that no one could replace. Healers did what they could, though their means were harsh. Wounds were washed with ale or brine, the sting endured as a sign that the corruption might be driven out. Herbs were pressed into poultices, garlic, honey, and yarrow, each believed to draw poison from the flesh. When rot ran too deep, hot iron was brought to sear the wound closed, the air filling with the stench of burned meat as the Viking man bit down on leather to muffle his cries. Sometimes the bleeding was stopped, the fever quieted, and survival followed. More often, the rot had already seeped into the blood, and no cure could touch it. The horror of festering wounds lay not only in death, but in the betrayal of hope. Families believed their kin had survived the worst once they returned from battle or childbirth, only to lose them days later. The halls grew heavy with sorrow, the rushes darkened with sweat and blood, and the knowledge spread that no warrior's courage nor mother's strength could shield against this hidden foe. When wounds fester, they teach a cruel lesson that victory and life itself may yet turn to ash, that the joy of survival can be stolen by rot unseen. The Vikings faced this truth with grim acceptance, knowing that even in triumph, death often waited, silent and patient, in the blood. Bloodletting and burning were the blades and firebrands of Viking medicine, remedies as feared as the sicknesses they sought to cure. When disease or festering wounds laid a Viking man low, when fever gripped a Viking child, or when the belly of a Viking woman throbbed with hidden pain, the healer's answer was often cruel. To open the flesh and let blood flow, or to press hot iron upon the body, were acts meant to chase out the poison of illness. To endure them was to submit not only to pain, but to fate, trusting that suffering might purchase life. The practice of bloodletting was bound to the belief that sickness came from imbalance. Too much blood in the body, they thought, bred fever, swelling, or madness. Thus, to spill some was to restore harmony. A healer would take a sharp knife, or in some places the sharpened horn of an animal, and cut a vein, letting the blood drip into a bowl. A Viking man, trembling with fever, might feel his strength ebb as the life ran from him, but those around him prayed that the sickness was draining away with it. Sometimes the treatment seemed to bring relief, the fever cooling, the body growing calmer. Other times the victim weakened until he was unable to rise again. Still, the act was repeated, for to do nothing was seen as a greater sin against hope. Children were not spared. A Viking child who coughed blood or wasted from fever might be cut in the arm or leg, his small body racked with sobs as his kin looked on with grim resolve. To them, such cruelty was mercy, a desperate gamble to save a life otherwise doomed. For Viking women, bloodletting was sometimes used after childbirth, when fever threatened. The healer's knife sought to release the bad blood festering within, though more often it drained what little strength remained in the mother. These were cures worse than the affliction, yet they endured across generations, for when faced with helplessness, even a knife seemed a kind of answer. When bloodletting failed, burning was the next defence. To cauterize was to close wounds, to burn away rot, to seal the flesh from further corruption. A shard of iron was heated in the fire until it glowed red, then pressed to the wound, the hall filled with the hiss of searing flesh, the sickened stench rising like a foul spirit. The Viking man bore it with clenched teeth, gripping wood or leather, knowing that to scream was no dishonour, but to survive was the greater victory. Sometimes the burning stopped the bleeding and kept death at bay. At other times, the wound deepened, the body wasted, and the fire claimed more than it healed. These methods were brutal, yet they carried weight beyond flesh. To bleed or to burn was to show the gods that no effort was spared, no suffering withheld, in the struggle to live. In a world where fate was woven by the Norns, men and women clung to whatever tools they had, even those that cut as sharply as disease itself. Bloodletting and burning were the grim prayers of Viking medicine, written not in words but in pain, a testament to a people who faced even their healing, as they faced battle with endurance, with courage, and with the will to defy death, if only for another day. Charms, runes, and sacrifice were the deeper roots of Viking healing, for when herbs and knives failed, the people turned to powers unseen. To the Viking mind, sickness was rarely only a matter of flesh. It was bound to the will of gods, to curses whispered by enemies, or to spirits that clung to the blood. If a Viking man wasted with fever, if a Viking child shook with fits, or if a Viking woman's body failed after childbirth, their kin knew that mere hands could not save them. The old ways chants, runes carved into wood and stone, and the spilling of blood in sacred groves were called upon to bend fate itself. Charms were spoken first, for words held power. The healer, or sometimes the vulva, would whisper lines passed down through generations, binding the sickness with rhythm and rhyme. Over the bed of the afflicted, charms were repeated again and again, weaving a net of sound meant to trap the illness and force it to loosen its grip. Some charms named Odin, begging for wisdom, others invoked Thor to smash the demon of disease, while others called on Freya to shield mothers and children. Families listened in silence, clinging to every word, as though the breath of the healer could pull their kin back from hell's shadow. Runes carried this power further, etched into driftwood, bone, or smooth stones. A piece of wood carved with the rune algis, symbol of protection, might be tied to a Viking child's neck, while a warrior, stricken with fever, might clutch a stone carved with soilo, the rune of the sun, in hopes its warmth would burn the sickness away. Sometimes runes were scratched into drinking horns, their marks washed away in ale or water, the liquid swallowed so that the runes themselves entered the body. These symbols were not seen as mere signs, but as living forces, threads of power that could shift the weave of fate. Yet when charms and runes faltered, sacrifice remained the final plea to gods and spirits. A goat might be led to the grove, its blood spilled into the earth while prayers rose to the sky. In harsher times, when the sickness had claimed too many and despair weighed heavy, a treasured horse might be slain, its spirit sent to carry the plea to Odin's hall. Some whispered that thralls, too, were given in such moments, their deaths offered to spare the lives of the free. These acts were not taken lightly, but desperation made them necessary, for in the Viking world, life was a constant struggle against forces too vast to master. The power of charms, runes, and sacrifice lay not only in their mystery, but in the hope they gave. They reminded Viking men and women that they were not helpless, that even in the grip of unseen enemies, they could act, could fight, could demand the attention of gods and spirits. To carve, to chant, to spill blood was to refuse surrender, and though many still perished, their deaths were not without meaning, for their kin had shown devotion, and the gods had seen their suffering. In this way, magic as medicine was less about curing the body than about strengthening the soul, binding family and fate together in defiance of the darkness. The herbs of the north were as much a part of Viking life as the axe and the oar, for in a world where disease and wounds lurked at every turn, plants became weapons against the unseen enemy. The Viking man might carry a blade into battle, but his kin at home carried knowledge of roots and leaves gathered in meadows, mountains, and along the fjords. These herbs were more than food or flavouring. They were life itself, the fragile barrier between survival and the grave. Foremost among them was Angelica, the sacred plant of the northern lands. Its tall stalks and sweet roots were prized not only as nourishment, but as a shield against sickness. A Viking child with fever might be given a tea brewed from its leaves, while a Viking woman, weary from childbirth, was offered its root to restore strength. Skalds sang that Angelica carried the blessing of the gods, a gift planted in the earth to protect their people from plague. Families stored it carefully through the winter, dried and bundled, for without it, illness struck harder and left fewer survivors. Garlic, sharp and biting, was another guardian of the hall. Its cloves were chewed raw, their fiery taste believed to drive poisons from the blood. Healers pressed it into poultices, binding it against festering wounds, hoping its power would cleanse the rot before it spread. Mixed into Viking food, garlic was thought to strengthen the body against wasting diseases, its pungent scent seen as a barrier to evil spirits. When coughs echoed through the longhouse, garlic broth simmered over the fire, its steam rising with whispered prayers that the sickness would pass. Yarrow, humble yet powerful, grew wild across the meadows. Its leaves, when crushed, staunched bleeding in battle and soothed cuts from axe and plough alike. A Viking warrior, struck by blade, might have his wound packed with yarrow to slow the blood's flow while charms were spoken over him. In times of fever, its flowers were brewed into bitter tea, forcing sweat from the body in the hope of casting out the illness. To the Vikings, yarrow was a faithful ally, always near, always ready to lend its strength. Juniper, mugwort, fennel, and thyme also found their place in the healer's satchel. Juniper berries were burned in the hearth, their smoke drawn over the sick to cleanse the air. Mugwort was bound into charms and hung above the beds of Viking children to guard them in the night. Fennel eased the belly when food turned foul, and thyme was boiled into draughts to steady the breath of those wasting from cough and phlegm. Even honey, gathered from hives along forest edges, was mixed with herbs to soothe throats and seal wounds, its sweetness carrying both nourishment and healing. The gathering of herbs was itself a ritual. Viking women and healers often cut plants at dawn when the dew still clung to their leaves, murmuring chants as they harvested. Some roots were dug only at night, when the moon gave them hidden strength. Every plant carried a spirit, and to use it without respect was to risk angering the unseen forces that governed health and fate. The herbs of the north did not always save lives, but they gave hope, courage, and the will to fight when the body faltered. In every hall, bundles of dried plants hung from rafters, their scent mingling with smoke and mead, silent witnesses to the endless struggle against sickness. They were the quiet weapons of a people who knew that steel could not defend against every foe, and that sometimes survival rested not on strength of arm, but on the leaves and roots gathered from the wild earth itself. Lessons written in bone are lessons carved deeper than parchment, for the earth itself has kept the story of Viking health. Long after the fires of their halls went cold, after the cries of Viking children and the clash of Viking men in battle had faded into memory, their bones remained. Dug from graves beneath mounds and churchyards, they speak still, whispering truths about sickness, hunger, toil, and survival in the age of the Northmen. What no skald thought to sing, the bones themselves have preserved. a saga of flesh turned to ash, of struggle etched into marrow. The bones tell of hardship first. Skulls and ribs bear the marks of disease pitting where fevers burned, lesions where infection spread, and twisted spines where childhood sickness stunted growth. Viking children often show signs of rickets, their bones bowed from lack of sunlight and scarce nourishment during long winters. Teeth, cracked and worn, carry lines of famine, scars left by years when Viking food was too little, when bellies shrank and the land yielded poorly. Even the smallest skeletons reveal how many never grew to adulthood, how fragile life was in a world of hunger and plague. But there is more than weakness in these remains. Viking men carried wounds that speak of battle and endurance. Healed fractures show that some who suffered grievous injuries lived on, their bones knitting back together under the care of kin and healer. Blades left their signature in notched skulls, yet many survived the first blow, living long enough for the wound to scar into bone. This endurance reveals a people hardened by struggle, their bodies often broken, but their spirit refusing to yield until fate itself demanded it. The bones also whisper of the diseases that plagued them. Traces of leprosy linger in faces eaten away by decay, jaws eroded and nasal bones collapsed. Signs of tuberculosis remain in ribs fused by infection, evidence of the long-dying breath that once echoed through their halls. Even the pitting of joints tells the tale of arthritis, where age brought no peace but only pain, as Viking elders hobbled through the last years of life with fire in their bones. These remains prove that disease was not rare, it was constant, shaping every life from birth to grave. Yet the bones also reveal resilience. Women who bore the scars of childbirth lived long enough to raise kin, though the ordeal claimed many others. Men who lost teeth or suffered crippling wounds adapted, cared for by their families. The graves show not only sickness, but compassion. Herbs placed beside bodies, charms laid with the dead, offerings of food and weapons that suggest the Vikings did not see suffering as meaningless, but as part of the thread of fate each must endure. What archaeology uncovers is a truth the sagas seldom sang, that Viking life was bound as much by sickness as by conquest, that disease shaped their world as surely as axe and oar. These lessons written in bone remind us that behind every raid, every voyage, every hall filled with feasting, there was struggle, frailty, and death. The Vikings lived knowing their bodies were fragile, yet they faced life with fierce resolve, carrying their scars with honour. And though their flesh has long since crumbled, their bones keep the story alive, a testament to endurance in a world without mercy. From saga to science, the tale of Viking disease is one that bridges the world of myth and the revelations of bone and earth. The sagas speak of heroes, of Viking men who sailed far across the seas, of Viking women who kept the hearth alive, of Viking children who grew beneath the shadow of gods and giants. Yet, between the lines of those tales lies a harsher truth. Sickness walked beside them as closely as kin. Fevers, plagues, and wasting afflictions shaped their days as surely as battle and storm. And these hidden foes guided the fate of the Northmen in ways their skalds seldom named, but which their bones still whisper to us now. The diseases that haunted their world were merciless. Leprosy turned the strong into exiles, branding their faces with the mark of divine punishment and driving them into solitude. Tuberculosis stole the breath of the mighty, leaving halls filled with the rattle of lungs and the cough of blood. Dysentery and gut rot crept into every feast, every barrel of Viking food, robbing households of life with swiftness and stench. Smallpox scarred the survivors and blinded others, its speckled hand marking families for generations. The cursed fire of ergot from poisoned rye sent Viking men and women into fits of madness, visions, and decay, while the plague itself swept fjords and towns clean of their people, silencing the thing and turning thriving settlements into graveyards. Behind these shadows lingered fevers and sweats that claimed lives overnight, and sepsis that mocked the victories of childbirth and battle by carrying away those who thought themselves safe. These sicknesses did not only bring death, they shaped destiny. Whole villages lost their strength, their numbers thinned by plague or famine, leaving survivors to seize greater power or to wander in search of new lands. It may be that the hunger to raid, to trade, to settle across seas was not only born of ambition, but also of necessity, driven by the push of sickness and scarcity at home. A Viking man who buried half his kin to disease may have felt the call of distant shores as both escape and promise. The spread of illness along trade routes bound them to the wider world, carrying not only silver and silk, but also death in unseen forms. Science now confirms what saga only hinted. Their bones carry the scars of infection, their teeth reveal years of famine, their graves speak of mothers lost in childbirth and warriors broken by festering wounds. The myths of divine punishment or sorcery gave meaning in their time, but the marks left behind tell a story of bacteria, parasites, and poisoned grain. Yet, even stripped of myth, the truth only deepens respect for their endurance. For though disease was relentless, the Vikings endured. They fought it with herbs and charms, with fire and sacrifice, with the stubborn will that defined them. Their destiny was shaped as much by the struggle to survive as by conquest and exploration. And even now, when science peers into their bones, the echo of their suffering remains. From saga to science, the story of Viking disease is not one of defeat, but of resilience, a reminder that courage is not only found on the battlefield, but also in the quiet, unending war against the frailty of the flesh.